In order to strengthen our community in a tangible way, I'm here to argue that we need to offer educational opportunities for the incarcerated. For the last several semesters, I've taught with a nonprofit based in Nashville called the Tennessee Higher Education Initiative. It partners colleges and universities with prisons to offer on-site, degree-bearing college courses for credit to incarcerated learners. My first trip to the prison, I would like to say, was just nerve-wracking. But when I was speaking with Julie Duchin, who runs the nonprofit and who escorted me on my first night of class, she said, how about you just call a spade? You were terrified. And I was. I hoped that it hadn't shown on my face, but I guess that it did. I realized very quickly that I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but regardless, I had made a lot of assumptions, and I had expected bars and armed guards, and instead I found a building that looked a lot like a high school, but with more doors and metal detectors. And I expected aggressive men who were resentful of outsiders, but I found students who were eager to learn and grateful for the opportunity. I wasn't disrespected or objectified because I was a woman. I think that actually happens way more in the free world classroom than it does in the prison classroom. I was, in my students' eyes, a woman who had authority in my field, who had chosen to drive from Chattanooga to Nashville once a week to teach them how to write effectively within the expectations of an English Composition 1 course. And for that, my students expressed gratitude regularly, roughly once a week for the duration of the semester. And I don't know about any other teachers in this auditorium, but I rarely get that kind of gratitude before the day of the final exam in a free world classroom. I learned very quickly that those assumptions that I was making had colored my first experience with this kind of work, and I'm sad to say that that's true. But I also learned that those assumptions were built on police procedurals and other pop cultural representations of prisons. And the reality of the situation is that our current moment of mass incarceration is not reflected in that violent sociopath that you see on Law and Order and CSI. The majority of people serving time in prison right now are serving time for drug offenses and other nonviolent crimes. They're much more likely to be people of color or people from low-income backgrounds. They're people who have committed crimes that haven't hurt people directly. Nonetheless, they're wrong, but they're serving very harsh sentences, very long sentences, and very dehumanizing sentences for getting caught. And I learned quickly as well that these men were not unlike most of the people that I know. We tend to police neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, much more heavily than we police the suburbs and more affluent communities. And because of that, our prison population reflects that policy. And things like this, like race and class status, have been shown in study after study to impact a jury's verdict and a judge's sentencing. Eventually, I would come to know the dynamics that I was working in. I would learn more about the very real challenges that face the prison classroom. I would also learn that programs like this one offer life-changing opportunities for the men that they serve, for the women that they serve. I would learn that it would change me as a teacher and as a person, and that it has the ability to change the city in which it operates. So Chattanooga is heralded as a progressive and innovative city. We have our city has the first citywide typeface in the nation. We have the nation's fastest internet. We have a thriving eat and shop local movement. We have this rising status as a millennial city and as a startup city, and all of those things are wonderful qualities. And they're things that make me so proud to live here. But we also have notable wealth disparity and achievement gaps in our public school system that you could fly a plane through, and some of the fastest rising property costs in the nation, and a very real gang problem. And ignoring these challenges in favor of looking at all of the things that our city does well is problematic, because these are things that are leading causes of lives lost to criminal activity and incarceration. The United States is a nation built on the idea that freedom is a basic human right, yet we incarcerate more individuals per capita than all but one other nation in the world. We have about 2.3 million people in prison right now, and those incarceration rates are higher than China, they're higher than North Korea, and those high rates of incarceration have not led to a reduction in crime. Right? So something's clearly broken at the national level, but I have to point out that Tennessee has the highest crime rate in the nation, and Chattanooga over the last 10 years has had either the highest or second highest in Tennessee. That's led to high numbers of incarceration in our city, which has yielded more crime, which has yielded more incarceration. So there's a cycle at work. But educational programs like the one that I work for in Nashville have the power to change these kinds of trends. They reduce the likelihood that someone will reoffend. They lower our recidivism rates, the rate at which someone's going to relapse into a life of crime after release. And because I believe in this city and our ability to show compassion for all of our citizens, I want to see us make some real investment in strengthening our community and not just cleaning it up. Now, people who oppose this kind of programming tend to do so for monetary reasons rather than focusing on the humanizing ability of education. And in light of speaking to some of those concerns, I want to present a couple of figures. So in order for a student to be involved in the Tennessee Higher Education Initiative, they have to pay $20 per semester for their tuition, or towards their tuition. That's a fall, spring, sometimes a summer semester if we can get a teacher, if we can get enough interest in the course. And while that seems like a very small investment, we have to look at it relative to inmate pay. Now, Tennessee actually pays its inmates. Georgia doesn't, various other states doesn't. But our average inmate income is 17 cents an hour. The high end of that scale is somewhere around 50 cents an hour, and so to make the numbers a little easier, let's assume a man goes to prison and is given a job where he works 40 hours a week for 50 cents an hour. His annual income is $1,020. And when you compare that $40 to $60 in tuition money to an annual income of $1,020, that ratio is pretty proportional to the ratio of the average income in Tennessee and the average cost of going to community college for a year. So the numbers are pretty proportional, and I have to say that the rest of that tuition is not paid for through public tax dollars. It's paid for through private donation. So it costs our initiative about $2,500 per year per inmate. But the state of Tennessee spends $25,000 per individual every year. That's about $750 million every year being spent on our prison system. But educational programs like this one can lower the likelihood of recidivism to such an extent that we could save $9,000 in taxpayer money per released educated individual. And to put that another way, for every single dollar that's privately raised, we can save the state of Tennessee $3 to $4 in public tax money. Now, we talk a lot about what leads to someone going to prison, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens when someone comes out, because that tends to be a thing that we maybe forget about or don't look directly at. When someone comes out of prison in Tennessee, they're not eligible for welfare. They're not eligible for government-sponsored housing. They have to disclose their incarceration history on job applications. They're not eligible for certain scholarships. So opportunities for housing and work and education are really limited. Conditions of release often stipulate that a released convict cannot live in an area with high crime rates or known drug dealers. But people get into that shadow economy of selling drugs out of necessity in a lot of cases. And so this is just stuff that's present in their community. It sends them to prison. And then they come out and they're left looking for a stable life far away from home. And because that very low annual income tends to get seized by the government to pay for child support, to pay for court costs, these individuals have very little money saved to create a stable life upon release. But when you educate someone in prison at the post-secondary level, you reduce the likelihood that they're going to be involved in a violent altercation while incarcerated. You reduce the likelihood that they'll reoffend when they get out. You reduce the likelihood that they'll return to prison. And you allow them to stop thinking of themselves as criminals. They start thinking of themselves as students. And that changing sense of self is powerful and long-lasting. So I want to leave you with a story. Last summer, I taught a book club at the prison, and I got to see my first student make parole. And on his last night of class, I went up to him and I said, "Are you so excited?" And he said, "Yeah." And I apologize. That was a stupid question. I have no way of fathoming what that must feel like. But I said, what do you have lined up? Like, what's going on for you when you get out next week? And I was conflicted here as a teacher because this is a fantastic student. Maybe one of my favorites ever. When you're in that position in the free world classroom, you want to see that student again. You want that student to take your Comp 2 class. You want that student to take your Lit seminar. You want that student to take a creative writing class or a special topics class that you propose. But I never wanted to see this guy again. And I asked, "What do you have lined up? What's going on for you when you get out?" And he said, "Oh, well, I've got a job already. I've got a friend who is willing to loan me a car provided I can get it running. I mean, I'm pretty good at mechanics, so I should be okay there. And my friends and family got together about $3,000 in a bank account for me to make it to my first paycheck. And I have a friend who's going to let me sleep on his couch for $300 a month until I can afford to get my own place." And I said, "I hope you know how lucky you are. Very few people have any of that when they get out, much less all of that at their disposal." And he said, "Yeah, I know. I've seen people leave here. I've seen people come back. I know why people come back, and I know that this is really lucky for me. But somehow the job and the car and the money, it doesn't seem as important as the fact that I have a friend driving up from Georgia and a friend driving up from Alabama to see me walk through the gates of the prison on my release date." And he started to tear up. And he said, "I just didn't know that my freedom meant that much to anybody." Now, this student is now enrolled in college again, and he is set to earn his associate's degree in full within the year. And yeah. And this is what could be next for Chattanooga's incarcerated population. Now, as flooring as his statement was, the idea that somehow an individual's freedom doesn't mean anything because of his past, while that idea is flooring, it's not hard to see where it comes from. As I said at the beginning of this talk, we're a nation built on the idea that freedom is a basic human right. But we incarcerate members of minority communities and people from low-income backgrounds at significantly higher rates than we incarcerate the rich and the white. So for certain demographics, we've added a footnote to the idea of freedom that says, that that basic human right is readily revocable if you're caught doing something wrong. But the assumption that I think that the Tennessee Higher Education Initiative operates on is the fact that education should be a basic human right. Because education can rehabilitate, and education can free. Thank you.